Welcome to Audiobooks Vault. In this video, we will summarize the novel, Don Quixote by Miguel de Cervantes. Let's start. Introduction. Imagine a man so captivated by stories of knights and chivalry that he decides to transform himself into one, not merely in spirit, but in action, donning armor, naming a steed, and setting off on a quest for adventure in a world that has long left such ideals behind. This man is Don Quixote, a delusional but endearing figure whose journey into the realms of imagination and reality blurs the lines between madness and genius. Written over 400 years ago by Miguel de Cervantes, Don Quixote is not just a tale of humor and folly, it's a profound exploration of human nature. With a quirky, self-declared knight tilting at windmills he believes to be ferocious giants and a loyal but pragmatic squire, Sancho Panza, who follows him through thick and thin, the novel invites readers into a world brimming with laughter, heartbreak, and timeless truths. But Don Quixote is more than just a story of misadventures. It's a reflection on the power of dreams, the clash between ideals and reality, and the indomitable spirit of those who dare to live for something greater than themselves. The characters are flawed yet lovable, and their journey through Spain's golden countryside is as much an external adventure as it is an inward odyssey of self-discovery. Why has this story endured for centuries? Perhaps it's because Don Quixote speaks to the dreamer in all of us, the part that longs to see the world not as it is, but as it could be. Or maybe it's the poignant friendship between Quixote and Sancho, a bond that grows stronger through trials and triumphs, illuminating the beauty of loyalty and the complexity of human relationships. Whether you're drawn to the absurdity of a man battling imaginary foes or the deeper philosophical undertones that resonate through every page, Don Quixote promises to captivate you. It's a story that entertains, inspires, and challenges us to question the boundaries of reality and imagination. So, step into this whimsical, heartfelt journey. Laugh at the antics, ponder the questions, and marvel at the humanity of a man who dared to dream and a squire who dared to believe in him. Once you enter the world of Don Quixote, you'll never see your own world the same way again. Part 1. The story begins in a small village in La Mancha, Spain, where an aging nobleman, Alonso Quijano, lives a quiet life. Quijano is a man of modest means, owning a modest estate and spending his days reading books of chivalry. Over time, his obsession with these tales grows uncontrollable, and he begins to lose touch with reality. He believes the world of knights, damsels in distress, and heroic quests is not only real, but also in desperate need of revival. Determined to become a knight-errant himself, Quijano resolves to restore justice and defend the helpless. To do so, he decides to adopt the name Don Quixote de la Mancha to make his exploits legendary. His old, frail horse is rechristened Rocinante, which he considers a noble and fitting name for his steed. Don Quixote creates his knightly persona with grand enthusiasm. He finds an old suit of armor, which he polishes and repairs. The armor is incomplete, so he fashions a helmet by attaching a simple visor to a barber's basin. Though flimsy, he convinces himself it is impenetrable. For his chivalric devotion, he selects a peasant woman, Aldonza Lorenzo, who lives nearby. Quixote renames her Dulcinea del Toboso and imagines her as a noble lady of unparalleled beauty and grace, despite never having interacted with her in any meaningful way. With everything ready, Don Quixote sets out on his first adventure. Quixote's first journey is short but eventful. He encounters an inn, which he mistakes for a castle. The innkeeper, amused by Don Quixote's delusions, plays along with his fantasies. Quixote demands to be knighted so he can begin his noble quests. The innkeeper, eager to humor him, agrees and conducts an improvised knighting ceremony in the inn's courtyard. During the ceremony, Don Quixote performs a vigil over his armor, as is customary for knights. A group of guests mocks him, leading to a scuffle, but the innkeeper intervenes. After the fake ceremony, Don Quixote departs, ready to perform heroic deeds. As Don Quixote journeys onward, he comes across a farmer whipping a young boy who works as his servant. The boy is crying out for help, claiming the farmer has not paid him his wages. Don Quixote intervenes, chastising the farmer for his cruelty. He demands that the farmer pay the boy and stop the abuse. The farmer agrees, but once Don Quixote leaves, continues beating the boy. This incident showcases Don Quixote's good intentions but also highlights his inability to understand the real-world consequences of his actions. Continuing on his journey, Don Quixote encounters a group of merchants traveling to Murcia. He demands that they proclaim Dulcinea the most beautiful woman in the world. When they refuse to humor him, Don Quixote attacks them, but his makeshift lance breaks, and he is thrown off Rocinante. The merchants beat him and leave him humiliated on the roadside. Injured and disoriented, Don Quixote is helped by a passing farmer from his village, who recognizes him. The farmer brings Don Quixote back home, much to the concern of his household. Back at Don Quixote's home, his friends, the priest and the barber, and his housekeeper decide that his books of chivalry are to blame for his delusions. They resolve to burn the books in an effort to cure him. The priest and barber inspect each book carefully, debating whether it deserves to be destroyed. Some books are spared due to their literary merit, while others are condemned as dangerous nonsense. This humorous episode satirizes the popularity of chivalric romances during Cervantes' time. The housekeeper secretly burns the books while Don Quixote sleeps, and they seal up the library, telling him that an enchanter has spirited the books away. This fuels Don Quixote's belief that he is part of a grand adventure involving magical foes. After recovering from his injuries, Don Quixote remains determined to pursue his knightly adventures. His housekeeper and niece continue to plead with him to abandon his delusions, but their efforts are in vain. Don Quixote secretly prepares for a second journey. To ensure success, he decides he needs a squire. He recruits a poor but practical farmer, Sancho Panza, offering him grand promises of wealth and the governorship of an island. Sancho, lured by these promises despite his doubts, agrees to accompany him. Before leaving, Don Quixote secures supplies, including a donkey for Sancho to ride, and sets out with renewed vigor. As Don Quixote and Sancho begin their journey, they encounter their first adventure, a group of windmills in the distance. Don Quixote mistakes the windmills for giant monsters and charges at them, believing he will achieve glory by defeating them. He attacks with his lance, but as the windmill's sails turn, they knock him off Rocinante, leaving him battered and bruised. Sancho tries to explain the reality of the situation, but Don Quixote insists that an enchanter turned the giants into windmills to thwart him. Undeterred, Don Quixote presses on, seeking further exploits. On their journey, Don Quixote and Sancho come across a herd of sheep grazing in a field. Don Quixote, in his deluded state, believes they are two great armies about to engage in battle. He charges into the flock, scattering the sheep and angering the shepherds. They retaliate by throwing stones at him, injuring him severely. Sancho helps him retreat and tries to convince him of the truth, but Don Quixote remains steadfast in his belief that he has fought a heroic battle. Don Quixote and Sancho meet a group of traveling friars accompanying a lady in a coach. Don Quixote mistakes the friars for enchanters who have kidnapped the lady. He attacks the friars, unhorsing one of them. The frightened lady and her entourage try to explain the situation, but Don Quixote insists on rescuing her. A Basque squire from the lady's entourage intervenes, challenging Don Quixote to a duel. The chapter ends abruptly, leaving readers in suspense about the outcome of the fight. Picking up where the previous chapter left off, Don Quixote triumphs in his fight against the Basque. However, his victory is largely due to luck and the Basque's inferior weaponry. Don Quixote forces the Basque to promise to present himself to Dulcinea and declare her the most beautiful woman in the world. Satisfied, Don Quixote and Sancho resume their journey. The duo encounters a group of goat herds, who welcome them and share food and drink. During their stay, the goat herds tell the story of Marcella, a beautiful shepherdess, and Grisostomo, a lovesick poet who fell in love with her. Grisostomo recently died of a broken heart after Marcella rejected him. The goat herds invite Don Quixote and Sancho to Grisostomo's funeral, where Marcella is expected to appear. Don Quixote eagerly agrees, seeing the event as an opportunity for a new adventure. At Grisostomo's funeral, mourners gather to lament his tragic death and blame Marcella for his fate. To everyone's surprise, Marcella herself appears. Marcella defends herself eloquently, arguing that she never encouraged Grisostomo's advances and should not be blamed for his unrequited love. Her speech impresses everyone, including Don Quixote, who pledges to defend her honor if anyone tries to harm her. Marcella then disappears into the wilderness, leaving the crowd in awe. After the funeral, Don Quixote and Sancho continue their journey. Along the way, they encounter a group of Yangasan muleteers who have stopped to rest. Don Quixote believes the muleteers are threatening Rocinante when the horse wanders into their camp. He attacks the group, but they outnumber and overpower him and Sancho. The two are beaten and left injured on the roadside. Despite their injuries, Don Quixote remains undeterred, vowing to seek greater glory. Sancho, though skeptical, continues to follow his master, motivated by the promised reward of an island. Don Quixote and Sancho Panza rest in the countryside, where Rocinante wanders off and tries to mate with a group of mares owned by muleteers. Angered, the muleteers beat Rocinante. Seeing this, Don Quixote and Sancho attempt to avenge the horse but are also badly beaten. Bruised and defeated, they retreat to a nearby inn, which Don Quixote mistakenly believes to be a castle. At the inn, Don Quixote and Sancho receive a poor welcome. Don Quixote's wounds are treated with dubious remedies, and Sancho is forced to sleep in the stable. Trouble arises when Don Quixote causes a commotion, believing a servant to be a damsel in distress. The innkeeper demands payment for their stay, but Don Quixote refuses, citing knightly tradition that knights-errant never pay for lodging. In retaliation, the inn staff toss Sancho in a blanket as punishment. Don Quixote, unable to help, rationalizes the event as a necessary trial for Sancho. After leaving the inn, Don Quixote and Sancho come across a barber carrying a brass basin. Don Quixote, believing it to be the mythical helmet of Mambrino, charges at the barber and takes the basin. The terrified barber flees, leaving Don Quixote triumphant. Sancho, however, sees the object for what it truly is, a basin, and begins to question Don Quixote's grip on reality. Nonetheless, he continues to humor his master, dreaming of the promised governorship. Don Quixote and Sancho encounter a chain gang of criminals being escorted by guards. Don Quixote demands to know why the men are in chains. The prisoners, led by the cunning Gins de Passament, tell exaggerated tales of injustice to gain Don Quixote's sympathy. Believing it his knightly duty, Don Quixote attacks the guards and frees the prisoners. However, instead of showing gratitude, the criminals mock and rob the pair before fleeing. Sancho expresses frustration at their misfortune, but Don Quixote insists that he fulfilled his knightly duty. While traveling at night, Don Quixote and Sancho encounter a group of mourners carrying a coffin. Don Quixote assumes they are evil spirits and charges at them. The mourners flee, and Don Quixote claims victory. Sancho retrieves some food left behind by the mourners, and they feast, feeling triumphant despite the absurdity of the situation. Don Quixote and Sancho hear loud noises in the distance and approach cautiously. Don Quixote, convinced it is a great danger, prepares for battle. However, they soon discover that the sounds are coming from harmless fulling mills used for treating cloth. Sancho laughs at Don Quixote's mistake, angering the knight. Don Quixote, however, continues to reinterpret events to preserve his chivalric ideals. Don Quixote and Sancho come across two shepherds fighting over a bag of gold. Don Quixote intervenes, delivering a dramatic speech about justice and virtue. The shepherds, bemused, hand over the gold to avoid further trouble. Sancho is delighted by their newfound wealth, but the shepherds later return with reinforcements and take the gold back. This incident adds to Sancho's growing doubts about their quest. Still carrying the barber's basin, Don Quixote continues to insist it is the enchanted helmet of Mambrino. When they encounter other travelers, Sancho nervously tries to downplay Don Quixote's delusions, fearing ridicule. The travelers, confused and amused, let them pass, further illustrating the absurdity of Don Quixote's adventures. Don Quixote decides to explore the mystical cave of Montesinos, believing it holds great secrets. Sancho lowers him into the cave with a rope. After a short time, Don Quixote returns, claiming to have had a fantastical vision of the cave's inhabitants, including the legendary Montesinos and an enchanted lady. Sancho is skeptical, but Don Quixote insists his vision was real and full of profound meaning. Don Quixote and Sancho attend a puppet show performed by Master Pedro, who uses puppets to reenact historical events. Don Quixote, unable to distinguish the puppets from reality, believes they are under attack and charges at them, destroying the set. Master Pedro is revealed to be Gins de Passament, the escaped criminal. Don Quixote pays for the damages, leaving Sancho exasperated. Sancho begins to express open doubts about Don Quixote's quests and promises of riches. He questions the reality of Dulcinea, wondering why Don Quixote has never actually seen her. Don Quixote, unable to admit the truth, describes Dulcinea's beauty in exaggerated terms and blames an enchanter for hiding her from him. Don Quixote encounters a man transporting a caged lion. Convinced that fighting the lion will bring him eternal glory, Don Quixote demands the cage be opened. The lion, uninterested in Don Quixote's challenge, remains in the cage, much to Sancho's relief. Don Quixote, interpreting the lion's indifference as submission, declares himself victorious and continues on his way, much to Sancho's disbelief. Weary and battered, Don Quixote and Sancho return to the inn they had visited earlier, where they are once again mocked by the innkeeper and guests. A brawl breaks out, and Don Quixote attempts to mediate, but his efforts are in vain. Sancho begins to doubt the wisdom of continuing their journey, though he remains loyal to Don Quixote. Despite their hardships, Don Quixote remains optimistic and looks forward to future adventures. Don Quixote and Sancho Panza meet a young woman named Dorotea, who is in disguise as a shepherdess. She shares her tragic story. She is the daughter of a wealthy farmer, and her honor was betrayed by Don Fernando, who seduced her with false promises of marriage. After he abandoned her to pursue another woman, Dorotea disguised herself to seek refuge in the wilderness. Moved by her plight, Don Quixote vows to restore her honor, seeing it as his knightly duty. Sancho, however, is skeptical about becoming involved in yet another complex situation. Dorotea learns of Don Quixote's obsession with quests and enlists his help to reclaim her kingdom from a fictional giant named Pandafilando of the Scowlful look. This fabricated story is meant to distract Don Quixote from his delusions about Dulcinea. Dorotea pretends to be a queen in need of rescue, and Don Quixote eagerly agrees to help. Sancho, believing he will soon receive his promised governorship, supports the plan despite its absurdity. The group encounters Don Quixote's old friends, the priest and the barber, who have been searching for him. They learn of Dorotea's plan and decide to help her trick Don Quixote into returning home. The priest and barber dress in disguise to play along with Dorotea's story, further fueling Don Quixote's belief in the quest's legitimacy. Sancho begins to voice his doubts about Dulcinea, admitting that he has never seen her and questioning her existence. Don Quixote chastises him for his lack of faith, insisting that Dulcinea is a real and virtuous lady. This exchange highlights the growing tension between Don Quixote's illusions and Sancho's pragmatic worldview. The group arrives at an inn, which Don Quixote once again mistakes for a castle. At the inn, they meet a soldier, known as the Captive, who recounts his harrowing story. He was taken prisoner by pirates and enslaved in Algiers, but eventually escaped with the help of Zoraida, a Moorish woman who converted to Christianity and fled with him. This subplot intertwines themes of honor, love, and religious conflict, providing a dramatic contrast to Don Quixote's delusions. While at the inn, the group listens to another story, the tale of Anselmo and Lothario. In this story, Anselmo tests his wife's fidelity by asking his friend Lothario to seduce her. The plan backfires, leading to betrayal and tragedy. This tale serves as a cautionary allegory, warning against foolish tests of loyalty. The situation becomes more complicated when Don Fernando unexpectedly arrives at the inn with his new bride, Lucinda, whom he had forcibly married. Lucinda, however, is in love with another man, Cardenio, who is also at the inn. A dramatic confrontation ensues. Dorotea publicly accuses Don Fernando of his betrayal, and Lucinda reveals her love for Cardenio. Overwhelmed with guilt, Don Fernando repents and agrees to return to Dorotea, allowing Lucinda and Cardenio to reunite. During the chaos, Don Quixote sleeps in the inn, dreaming of a fierce battle with the giant Pandafilando. In his sleep, he attacks a set of wineskins, spilling their contents everywhere. The innkeeper, furious at the damage, demands compensation, but the group pacifies him by paying for the ruined wine. This comedic episode underscores Don Quixote's inability to distinguish fantasy from reality. The priest devises a plan to trick Don Quixote into returning home. They construct a makeshift cage and convince Don Quixote that he is enchanted, claiming it is necessary to transport him safely to the next stage of his quest. Don Quixote, believing this to be a magical trial, willingly enters the cage. Sancho, however, begins to grow increasingly disillusioned with his master's delusions. As they travel with Don Quixote in the cage, Sancho becomes frustrated with his lack of rewards. He confronts Don Quixote about the promised governorship, but Don Quixote deflects, assuring him that great rewards are still to come. Sancho's loyalty is tested as he grapples with the disparity between Don Quixote's promises and the reality of their adventures. The group encounters the Canon of Toledo, who engages Don Quixote in a philosophical debate about the merits of chivalric romances. The canon critiques these tales as unrealistic and harmful, while Don Quixote passionately defends their virtues. This discussion serves as a meta-commentary by Cervantes on the genre of chivalry, highlighting its appeal and its flaws. The group finally reaches Don Quixote's village. His friends and family are relieved to see him, but remain concerned about his mental state. Don Quixote, still believing himself to be enchanted, is placed under the care of his niece and housekeeper. Sancho, disheartened by the lack of tangible rewards, begins to question whether he should continue following Don Quixote. Sancho reflects on his loyalty to Don Quixote, weighing his master's grandiose promises against the hardships he has endured. Despite his doubts, he decides to remain with Don Quixote, hoping that future adventures will bring greater fortune. Back home, Don Quixote retreats into a quieter life, temporarily abandoning his quest for chivalry. However, his passion for knight-errantry remains, and he begins planning his next adventure. Sancho, meanwhile, continues to dream of the rewards his loyalty might eventually bring. Now Don Quixote sets the stage for future exploits. His friends and family attempt to dissuade him from leaving again, but Don Quixote's resolve is unshaken. He remains committed to his ideals, viewing himself as a hero destined to bring justice to the world. Sancho, despite his frustrations, agrees to accompany Don Quixote on another journey, signaling the continuation of their partnership. Part 2. As the story begins, news of Don Quixote's adventures from his first sally has spread across the region. His bizarre quests and delusions have become the subject of gossip and entertainment. People in his village either mock him or express concern for his sanity. Despite his injuries and the destruction of his library by his friends and family in the previous part, Don Quixote remains committed to the ideals of chivalry. He begins planning a third sally, eager to achieve even greater glory and honor for himself and his beloved Dulcinea del Toboso. Don Quixote convinces his loyal squire, Sancho Panza, to join him once again. Sancho is initially hesitant, as he remembers the hardships of their earlier adventures. However, Don Quixote renews his promise of granting Sancho the governorship of an island, rekindling the squire's hope for wealth and status. Sancho also reveals that he has been the target of ridicule in the village due to his association with Don Quixote. Nevertheless, his desire for potential rewards outweighs his doubts, and he agrees to accompany his master. Don Quixote and Sancho quietly prepare for their journey to avoid interference from the knight's niece and housekeeper, who had previously tried to keep him at home. They gather supplies, with Don Quixote making modifications to his battered armor and Sancho ensuring that his donkey, Dapple, is well-fed and ready for the road. Don Quixote also spends time composing love letters to Dulcinea, reaffirming his devotion to her as his inspiration and muse. Their journey begins with an encounter with a traveling puppeteer named Master Pedro, who entertains audiences with stories about legendary knights. Don Quixote becomes captivated by the performance and interprets the puppets as real people under attack. In his chivalric fervor, he charges at the puppets, destroying the stage. Master Pedro is furious, but Sancho calms him down by offering compensation. This incident reflects Don Quixote's inability to separate reality from illusion, a recurring theme in his adventures. Don Quixote and Sancho meet a royal courier transporting 2 caged lions as a gift for the king. Don Quixote insists on releasing the lions so that he can face them in combat, believing this will prove his bravery. The lion keeper reluctantly opens the cage, but the lions, uninterested in Don Quixote, remain inside. Interpreting this as a sign of his victory, Don Quixote declares himself triumphant. Sancho, relieved by the outcome, privately questions his master's judgment but continues to follow him. While traveling along a river, Don Quixote spots a small boat and believes it is enchanted. He convinces Sancho to board it with him, claiming it will take them to a magical castle where a great adventure awaits. The boat drifts aimlessly until it crashes into a mill. The millers rescue the pair, but Don Quixote accuses them of being enchanters who sabotaged their quest. Despite the mishap, Don Quixote remains optimistic, interpreting the event as another trial of his courage. Don Quixote and Sancho meet a wealthy duke and duchess who have heard of their exploits and decide to play along with their delusions for amusement. They welcome the pair into their castle and treat them as honored guests, pretending to believe in Don Quixote's knighthood. The duke and duchess take particular pleasure in mocking Sancho, exploiting his gullibility with false promises of wealth and power. They also stage elaborate pranks to confuse and humiliate Don Quixote, all while pretending to support his quest. As part of their elaborate jest, the Duke and Duchess appoint Sancho as the governor of a fictitious island. Sancho takes his role seriously, attempting to govern with wisdom and fairness. However, the responsibilities of leadership quickly overwhelm him, and he realizes the challenges of balancing justice and practicality. The Duke and Duchess further complicate matters by orchestrating absurd scenarios to test Sancho's decision-making skills. Despite his efforts, Sancho is eventually tricked into abandoning his governorship, returning to Don Quixote with a newfound appreciation for his simpler life. The Duke and Duchess introduce a new challenge to Don Quixote in the form of the dolorous duenna, a fictional noblewoman who claims to have been cursed by an evil wizard. She begs Don Quixote to break the curse by performing a series of heroic tasks. Don Quixote eagerly accepts the quest, but it quickly becomes clear that the duenna's story is another fabrication by the Duke and Duchess. Despite the deception, Don Quixote's sincerity and determination shine through, earning him the admiration of some onlookers. After enduring the Duke and Duchess's mockery, Don Quixote and Sancho leave the castle to continue their journey. Sancho reflects on the lessons he has learned from his brief stint as governor, realizing that power and wealth are not as fulfilling as he had imagined. Don Quixote, undeterred by the ridicule he faced, remains committed to his ideals of chivalry. He views the experience as a necessary trial, reaffirming his belief in his noble mission. The duo's bond grows stronger as they prepare for new adventures, with Sancho showing a deeper understanding of his master's quirks and Don Quixote expressing gratitude for Sancho's loyalty. Don Quixote and Sancho Panza arrive at the castle of the Duke and Duchess, who, having heard of Don Quixote's exploits, decide to amuse themselves by playing along with his delusions. They greet him as a renowned knight-errant and Sancho as his honorable squire, showering them with false praise and excessive hospitality. The Duke and Duchess see this as an opportunity for entertainment, concocting elaborate pranks designed to test Don Quixote's chivalric ideals and Sancho's gullibility. The Duke and Duchess introduce Don Quixote to a fictional noblewoman, the dolorous duenna, who claims to be under a curse from a malicious giant. She pleads with Don Quixote to help restore her honor by defeating the giant. Don Quixote immediately accepts the quest, seeing it as an opportunity to prove his valor. However, unbeknownst to him, the entire situation is fabricated, and the dolorous duenna is one of the Duchess's servants in disguise. The Duke and Duchess promise Sancho the governorship of an island, a long-standing dream fostered by Don Quixote's promises. They appoint him as governor of a small village, transformed into a mock court for their amusement. Sancho initially takes his role seriously, attempting to administer justice with wisdom and fairness. However, the Duke and Duchess orchestrate absurd scenarios to undermine his efforts. For example, they stage a case where a man accuses his neighbor of stealing his beard and demands Sancho resolve it. Sancho's rulings, though unorthodox, reveal his surprising intelligence and common sense. Despite his successes, the constant pranks and the pressures of leadership eventually exhaust him. The Duke and Duchess stage another prank involving a magical wooden horse named Clavelino the Swift. They tell Don Quixote and Sancho that the horse can fly and will take them to confront the giant who cursed the dolorous duenna. Blindfolded and seated on the wooden horse, Don Quixote and Sancho believe they are flying through the air, even though they never leave the ground. The prank culminates in a staged explosion, after which Don Quixote and Sancho are told they have successfully lifted the curse. Sancho, shaken by the experience, begins to question the value of their adventures, while Don Quixote interprets it as a triumph of his knightly prowess. As governor, Sancho faces increasingly ridiculous challenges, including being forced to fend off a mock siege and deal with nonsensical legal disputes. Despite his best efforts, he realizes that his position is a farce designed to humiliate him. Disillusioned and homesick, Sancho resigns his governorship and returns to Don Quixote, expressing relief at leaving behind the burdens of power. The experience deepens Sancho's understanding of human nature and his own limitations. The Duke and Duchess invite Don Quixote and Sancho to participate in a hunting expedition. Don Quixote, unfamiliar with such pastimes, tries to apply his chivalric principles to the hunt, leading to comedic misunderstandings. During the outing, the Duke and Duchess continue to mock Don Quixote subtly, crafting situations that exploit his delusions. However, Don Quixote remains steadfast in his belief that he is fulfilling a noble mission. The Duke orchestrates a mock duel between Don Quixote and another servant disguised as the giant who cursed the dolorous duenna. Don Quixote, armed and eager for battle, faces the fake giant in a staged fight. The Duke manipulates the duel to ensure Don Quixote emerges victorious, further convincing him of his knightly prowess. Sancho, observing the absurdity of the event, grows increasingly skeptical of their adventures but remains loyal to his master. One night, the Duchess arranges for a group of servants to release cats into Don Quixote's room as he sleeps. The cats, frightened and disoriented, claw at Don Quixote, causing him minor injuries. Don Quixote interprets the attack as another trial orchestrated by an enchanter, reaffirming his belief in his divine mission. Sancho, however, sees it as yet another example of how they are being mocked. After abandoning his governorship, Sancho reflects on his brief experience with power. He realizes that governing is far more complex than he had imagined, requiring wisdom, patience, and strength. Despite his failure, he takes pride in the fairness of his judgments and vows to remain true to his values. This introspection marks a turning point for Sancho, as he begins to see himself not just as a follower, but as a thoughtful individual. The Duke and Duchess stage one final prank involving an enchanted boat. They convince Don Quixote and Sancho to board the vessel, claiming it will take them to Dulcinea. The boat, untethered, drifts down a river, eventually capsizing in shallow waters. Don Quixote views the mishap as the work of enchanters thwarting his mission. Sancho, however, grows more frustrated with their misfortunes, expressing doubt about the wisdom of continuing their journey. Having exhausted their amusement, the Duke and Duchess send Don Quixote and Sancho on their way, offering them gifts and false assurances of their support. Don Quixote, unaware of the ridicule he has endured, departs with renewed determination to pursue his knightly quest. Sancho, now fully aware of the Duke and Duchess's cruelty, feels betrayed but chooses to remain loyal to Don Quixote out of friendship and hope for better adventures. After leaving the Duke and Duchess castle, Don Quixote and Sancho Panza resume their journey, filled with hopes for new adventures. Don Quixote remains fixated on performing heroic deeds to win eternal glory and prove his devotion to Dulcinea. Sancho, though more skeptical than before, continues to follow his master loyally. As they make their way toward Barcelona, they encounter various travelers, including scholars, merchants, and peasants. Don Quixote often engages them in conversations about chivalry and honor, which leads to both humorous misunderstandings and occasional philosophical debates. In one town, Don Quixote and Sancho visit the home of a wealthy gentleman who owns a mechanical talking head. The head, operated secretly by hidden mechanisms, answers questions posed to it. Don Quixote believes the head is enchanted and consults it about his destiny. The head gives vague and cryptic answers, which Don Quixote interprets as a validation of his quest. Sancho, meanwhile, remains dubious but humors his master. Don Quixote and Sancho attend the wedding of a young farmer, Basilio, and a wealthy woman, Quiteria. The celebration takes a dramatic turn when another suitor challenges Basilio's right to marry Quiteria. Don Quixote, seeing an opportunity to uphold chivalric ideals, intervenes and supports Basilio. The conflict is resolved when Basilio tricks the rival suitor into withdrawing his claim, securing the marriage. Don Quixote sees this as a victory for love and honor, while Sancho is more interested in the abundant food and drink at the feast. Don Quixote hears of the legendary cave of Montesinos and decides to explore it, believing it holds great mysteries. With the help of Sancho and a guide, he is lowered into the cave. After spending some time inside, he emerges claiming to have seen miraculous visions. Don Quixote describes encounters with legendary figures and magical happenings, though Sancho doubts the veracity of his master's story. This episode reinforces Don Quixote's belief in the supernatural and his destiny as a knight-errant. Don Quixote's obsession with Dulcinea continues to shape his actions. Sancho, feeling guilty for deceiving his master earlier, tries to convince Don Quixote that Dulcinea remains enchanted and inaccessible. The pair encounter a group of actors dressed as noble characters, and Don Quixote mistakes one of the actresses for Dulcinea. He kneels before her, proclaiming his devotion. The actress, bewildered, plays along to avoid upsetting him. Sancho observes the interaction with a mix of amusement and pity. On their way to Barcelona, Don Quixote and Sancho are captured by a group of bandits led by the infamous rogue Guinart. Instead of harming them, Roque takes an interest in Don Quixote's ideals and engages him in a conversation about justice and morality. Roque ultimately releases them unharmed, providing food and supplies for their journey. This encounter highlights the contrast between Don Quixote's idealism and the harsh realities of the world. Don Quixote and Sancho arrive in Barcelona, where they are greeted warmly by Don Antonio Merino, a wealthy and curious gentleman who has heard of their exploits. Don Antonio invites them to stay at his home and takes them on tours of the city. Don Antonio, like others before him, enjoys testing Don Quixote's delusions. He shows him a supposed enchanted mirror that claims to reveal truths. Don Quixote, captivated, believes the mirror affirms his knightly mission. During their time in Barcelona, Don Quixote is challenged to a duel by a mysterious knight calling himself the Knight of the White Moon. The challenger claims that if Don Quixote loses, he must abandon his life as a knight-errant and return home. Don Quixote, confident in his abilities, accepts the challenge but is ultimately defeated. The Knight of the White Moon reveals himself as Samson Carrasco, Don Quixote's old friend, who devised this plan to force Don Quixote to abandon his dangerous adventures. Defeated and honor-bound by his promise, Don Quixote reluctantly begins the journey back to his village. Sancho tries to cheer him up, but Don Quixote is overcome with despair, feeling that he has failed as a knight-errant. The return journey is marked by encounters with various travelers and incidents that provide moments of both comedy and reflection. Don Quixote begins to show signs of self-doubt, questioning the value of his quest. As they near their village, Don Quixote starts to reflect on the passing of the age of chivalry. He laments the loss of honor, virtue, and noble deeds in the modern world. His musings reveal a deep longing for meaning and purpose, even as he faces the reality of his limitations. Sancho remains steadfastly loyal, offering comfort and support. Despite his doubts, he continues to share in Don Quixote's belief that their adventures have brought them closer to understanding life's mysteries. After his defeat by the Knight of the White Moon, Don Quixote and Sancho Panza return to their village, where the knight solemnly plans to abandon his life of adventure as he promised. The journey back is somber, as Don Quixote reflects on his failures and Sancho struggles to lift his master's spirits. Despite the melancholy mood, they still encounter villagers and travelers who provide moments of humor and philosophical reflection. Sancho attempts to reignite Don Quixote's sense of purpose by suggesting new adventures, but the knight remains bound by his oath to renounce knighthood. He insists that his duty now lies in living a quiet, honorable life at home. Don Quixote's resolve to give up knighthood wavers slightly when he learns of a rumored jousting tournament in a nearby town. Sancho encourages him to participate, thinking it might revive his master's spirit. However, upon arriving, they discover that the event is a farce, orchestrated more for entertainment than honor. Humiliated by the mockery, Don Quixote begins to question the validity of chivalric ideals altogether. Sancho, ever loyal, reminds him of the joys and camaraderie they've shared, offering a glimpse of hope amidst his despair. While traveling through the countryside, Don Quixote and Sancho are ambushed by a group of thieves who rob them of their few remaining possessions. The bandits mock Don Quixote's armor and Sancho's hopeful demeanor. Despite this setback, Don Quixote consoles Sancho by claiming that suffering is an integral part of a knight-errant's journey. Sancho, although disheartened, agrees to press on, showcasing his unwavering devotion. Don Quixote's health begins to deteriorate as the physical toll of his adventures catches up with him. He becomes more introspective, pondering the meaning of life and the pursuit of honor. His once vivid imagination starts to fade, replaced by moments of lucidity where he acknowledges the absurdity of his past exploits. Sancho, deeply worried about his master, tries to care for him by offering stories of their shared adventures. He hopes to spark Don Quixote's fighting spirit, but the knight's growing frailty dampens his enthusiasm. Encouraged by Sancho, Don Quixote briefly entertains the idea of one final quest to restore Dulcinea's honor. He devises a plan to journey to the mountains and live as a hermit, believing that penance and prayer might break the enchantment on his beloved. Sancho reluctantly agrees to accompany him, though he harbors doubts about the feasibility of the mission. Along the way, they encounter shepherds and farmers who offer simple wisdom that contrasts sharply with Don Quixote's lofty ideals. In a small village, Don Quixote mistakes a farmer's daughter for a noblewoman in distress. He offers his assistance, proclaiming her to be an emissary of Dulcinea. The girl and her family play along to avoid offending the eccentric knight. The incident, though light-hearted, underscores Don Quixote's persistent inability to distinguish reality from fantasy. Sancho, while amused, begins to sense that their time on the road is drawing to a close. As they travel, Sancho reflects on his experiences with Don Quixote, realizing how much he has grown in understanding and resilience. He shares his thoughts with his master, speaking candidly about the importance of friendship, loyalty, and finding joy in simple things. Don Quixote listens intently, acknowledging the profound impact Sancho has had on his life. The knight begins to view his squire not merely as a servant but as a true companion and equal. Caught in a fierce storm, Don Quixote and Sancho take refuge in a small cave. The storm becomes a metaphor for Don Quixote's internal struggles, as he laments the futility of his quest and the loss of his youthful vigor. Sancho comforts him, urging him to cherish the adventures they've shared and the bonds they've formed. The storm passes, leaving Don Quixote physically weakened but emotionally at peace. Upon reaching their village, Don Quixote is greeted by his friends, including the priest and the barber, who express relief that he has returned alive. They attempt to cheer him up by recounting tales of his bravery, but Don Quixote is too disillusioned to take pride in his exploits. He retires to his home, where his niece and housekeeper care for him. Sancho remains by his side, steadfast in his devotion to his master. In a moment of clarity, Don Quixote renounces his identity as a knight-errant. He declares that he was misled by books of chivalry and resolves to spend his remaining days in quiet reflection. This decision shocks Sancho, who struggles to reconcile the loss of his master's adventurous spirit. Don Quixote reassures him that their bond transcends the roles they once played, and he expresses gratitude for Sancho's loyalty. Don Quixote falls gravely ill, confined to his bed. He spends his days reflecting on his life and the lessons he has learned. He acknowledges the harm caused by his delusions but also takes solace in the friendships and memories he has gained. Sancho remains a constant presence, tending to his master and sharing stories of their adventures. Despite his sorrow, Sancho tries to keep Don Quixote's spirits up, demonstrating the depth of their friendship. As his condition worsens, Don Quixote makes peace with his past. He dictates his will, leaving instructions for his burial and bequeathing his modest belongings to his niece and friends. He also expresses a wish for Sancho to find happiness and prosperity, recognizing the sacrifices his loyal squire has made. Their final conversations are filled with mutual respect and affection, showcasing the profound bond they share. Don Quixote, now fully lucid, reclaims his true identity as Alonso Quijano. He dies peacefully, surrounded by those who love him. His passing marks the end of an extraordinary journey, leaving behind a legacy of courage, humor, and humanity. Sancho is devastated by his master's death, but takes comfort in the memories of their adventures. He resolves to honor Don Quixote's legacy by living a life of integrity and kindness. The story concludes with a reflection on the impact of Don Quixote's life. Though his adventures were marked by folly and failure, they also revealed the enduring power of dreams, loyalty, and the human spirit. Sancho returns to his family, carrying with him the lessons learned from his time with Don Quixote. The knight's friends vow to protect his legacy, ensuring that his story will inspire future generations. Conclusion to Don Quixote by Miguel de Cervantes. As the final chapter closes on the life of Don Quixote, one cannot help but reflect on the extraordinary journey of a man who dared to chase an impossible dream. What began as the humorous tale of an aging gentleman tilting at windmills transforms into a deeply moving exploration of human ideals, the limits of reality, and the boundless resilience of the human spirit. Don Quixote, with his dented helmet and makeshift lance, may have been a figure of ridicule to those who crossed his path, but beneath the surface of his delusions lay an unwavering commitment to honor, love, and a world governed by noble ideals. His steadfast belief in Dulcinea, a peasant woman he saw as the epitome of virtue, and his tireless quest to revive chivalry highlight the beauty and tragedy of seeing the world not as it is, but as it ought to be. Yet, this is not a story of one man alone. Sancho Panza, his loyal squire, serves as the perfect counterbalance, a realist to Don Quixote's dreamer, a grounding force to his master's flights of fancy. Over the course of their adventures, Sancho evolves from a simple, practical man into a figure of wisdom and compassion, showing us that even the most grounded among us can be touched by the magic of dreams. What makes Don Quixote timeless is its ability to straddle the line between comedy and tragedy, laughter and tears. The absurdity of Don Quixote's misadventures is tempered by the profound questions his life poses. What does it mean to live with purpose? Can one person's dreams reshape the world? And is madness truly madness if it brings joy, hope, and inspiration to others? As Don Quixote breathes his last and renounces his knightly ideals, we are left with a bittersweet sense of closure. His death marks the end of an era, not only for him, but for a world that has grown disenchanted with romance and idealism. Yet his spirit endures, reminding us of the enduring power of imagination, courage, and belief in something greater than oneself. Don Quixote is more than a novel, it's a mirror held up to humanity. It reveals our flaws, celebrates our virtues, and invites us to dream, even in the face of impossible odds. It teaches us that the greatest adventures are not always those fought with swords and shields, but those fought within ourselves, as we grapple with who we are and who we strive to become. In the end, Don Quixote's story is not just his own, it is ours. It is a reminder that even the most quixotic among us have something to teach, and even the most grounded among us can learn to dream. As we close the book, we carry with us the wisdom of a man who, in his folly, lived more fully than many ever dared to dream. If you enjoyed the summary, then like the video and subscribe to Audiobooks Vault. Tell us if there is any other book you want us to summarize. Goodbye.